Thank you for joining us for our second Spring 2022 Spring Quarter Monday Seminar Series. Today we are happy and grateful to bring one of our own students, one of our PhD students in the School of Education of the larger graduate group in education, Ambar Hernandez Negrete. It's really exciting for me to be introducing Ambar, who I met many years ago now when she was an undergraduate student in my Education 100 class. And it's a large class. She was very much a big part of what made the class exciting. It was my first time teaching a large undergraduate course here at UC Davis. And I had learned earlier on that she was admitted. She hadn't talked to me about it, but I made sure to put the spotlight on her when she was in that class and asked who's been admitted to graduate programs, and Ambar had to raise her hand and we celebrated her there. So it's really exciting to celebrate her here now in our graduate group education space during the Monday seminars. Ambar Hernandez Negrete is doctoral candidate with a completely signed title page of her dissertation. And so she'll be walking this year, absolutely done. And she is in the school organization and educational policy program. Ambar was born in Oaxaca, Mexico, and raised in the northern coast of California. She is currently the a UC Provost Dissertation Fellow. And as we'll hear today, she has conducted research on ethnic studies policies, looking at Arizona's very restrictive policies around ethnic studies. And actually, she's looking at what happens on the ground with these when such policies are part of the everyday practices of schooling, particularly after those policies were rescinded in the state. So I'm going to now pass it over to Ambar Hernandez Negrete, who will be sharing a slice of her work with us today.
Wonderful. Thank you for your very kind words, Professor. So can everyone see my screen? Yes, perfect. So let me go ahead and get ready. Okay, wonderful. Well, I'm going to go ahead and get started. Thank you, everyone, for joining me today. I'm excited to engage you in my work as what Professor Dani Martinez has been sharing as really part of my larger critical policy analysis that I carry out and trying to understand the Mexican-American Studies program efforts to eliminate the Mexican-American Studies program in Tucson, Arizona. And this will be part of the work that I will be sharing at this year's AERA conference. So this will be shorter than most UG Brown presentations, but without further ado, the title of my presentation for today is They Don't Value Us as Human Beings, Centering Students in Policy Research and Processes. So for a brief overview of my study and for my presentation for today, I will first be delving into the positionality and research problem guiding this work, then delve into my methodology and some of the main themes that have emerged from my analysis before concluding with some final implications and discussion on these findings. So before delving into the study, I want to center my positionality and how that has informed the work that I am presenting and sharing with you all today, and how this research is an extension of my lived experiences as an immigrant from Oaxaca, Mexico. I was born in Oaxaca and migrated when I was 7 years old with my family to a predominantly white town in Sonoma County, Bonner Park, where I navigated what Angela Valenzuela refers to as subtractive schooling, where my educators and school leaders didn't really know how to leverage my cultural, linguistic, and my familial roots throughout my educational journey and learning experiences. One of the reasons why it led me to my alienation and disengagement from schooling. And it wasn't until I studied for a year in my hometown in Oaxaca, where I was able to reconnect with these roots, that I was able to drastically alter my educational trajectory, where before this reconnection, I was not on track for a four-year university, but after connecting with these roots, I was able to gain entrance to University of California, Davis as an undergraduate, where I received my first exposure to ethnic studies curriculum and educators and learning environments where my cultural, linguistic, and familial background were seen as a strength rather than as a deficit. And so experiencing firsthand the lack of access to this type of ethnic studies curriculum and experiences throughout my K-12 educational journey, I was really interested in understanding the policies that are currently or had been more contemporarily been restricting students' access to these types of learning environments and spaces, which leads me to the research study and particularly the questions that I will be sharing with you all today and focusing on for today's presentation, and related to really trying to understand students' perceptions of these policies that restrict their access to ethnic studies curriculum and learning environments. And the question guiding this work and the findings I will be centering today is, what are the ways in which use of color can inform policymaking processes? So for a little bit of a background on Tucson's Mexican American Studies program and its elimination, I want to highlight some key moments in time. For example, in 1998, where community members and educators organized to develop the Mexican American Studies program in response to the ongoing practices, discriminatory practices that Tucson Unified School District engaged towards the Mexican American student population, which the 1974 Fisher Mendoza versus TUSD found TUSD guilty for underserving this particular student population. And despite this particular program allowed students to take courses or mainstream courses in American government and history through a critical Mexican American lens. And despite the effectiveness and the drastic improvement in academic outcomes in terms of academic grades, attendance, and high school graduation, Superintendent of the time, Tom Horn, eliminated this program through the House Bill 2281 in 2010, claiming that the program promoted the overthrow of the US government and resentment towards another race. 7 years later, federal judge Wallace Tashima ruled this bill unconstitutional, claiming or finding that it was driven by racial animus. And now, despite being ruled unconstitutional, the program has yet to be fully reinstated, and students can no longer take courses in these areas throughout their entire high school experience, but rather very restricted and limited. And on to my next slide. So throughout this entire legislative process, students' voices and needs were disregarded. And despite their continued efforts and their fierce organization and resilience towards attempting to challenge the passage of this particular policy, they were disregarded and excluded throughout this process. As you can see the image here, here are some of the students that disrupted a board meeting and a vote that would be taking place to try to stop the efforts to protect and to eliminate a program that they found indispensable for their educational journey. And this particular process and exclusion of youth reflects larger scholarship and research that continues to document how youth of color are marginalized and ignored in policymaking. And Jean Wright, Noguera, and Camarota point to how youth of color continue to be positioned as objects of policy rather than as actors who possess the rights and abilities to shape policy. So with this background in mind, the following conceptual frames guide my work. So first, I draw on critical race theory to try to understand the ways in which why we continue to adopt educational policies that are detrimental to communities of color, that continue to restrict educational opportunities to them and regress progress that we have made, and adopt policies that we would not continue to implement if we knew they had the same similar detrimental outcomes for white students or dominant students. And critical race theory also allows or encourages the importance of incorporating communities of color in any type of educational reform and transformation. Then expanding this particular frame, civic engagement helps me understand and explain the ways in which youth can and should be participating in the construction of our society, and documents the powerful ways in which they are organizing and have the potential and capacity to contribute to civic processes like policymaking. With this frameworks in mind, I carried out the following critical race policy analysis. So I carried out this study virtually in Tucson, Arizona, particularly in an American government 11th grade high school class, where I was able to gain entrance given my participation in a Chito development course, where I connected with one of the educators and founders of the ethnic studies mass program in Tucson, Arizona, and connected me with an educator who continued to be on the ground. And this particular school, the demographics consist of predominantly Latinx students, and then 47% of the students identified or were eligible for free and reduced lunch. So the main sources of data I collected for this work consist of classroom observations and student interviews. So throughout my I conducted these classroom observations throughout 12 weeks from August through to December 2020 through Zoom. And through this time, I was able to collect field memos that gave me context into that might be shaping students' responses in my interviews, and as well gave space for me to be able to counter harmful colonial practices of extracting knowledge from communities of color, and instead employ more humanizing research approaches where I sought to build dialogic relationships with youth and the participants of my study. The interviews I conducted consisted of 8 semi-structured interviews with 11 high school graders, 7 of which identified as Latinx, 1 as biracial, 6 as first generation, and 2 as second generation. And these interviews lasted anywhere from 60 to 90 minutes. So as part of my effort to move towards a youth-centered critical race policy analysis, I sought out ways to more directly and more actively engage students in understanding the education policies I was examining. And this translated into looking at other tools I could leverage in my interview. And particularly, I chose, given the opportunity to have students watch and respond to publicly available legislative clips where they heard some of the main arguments that policymakers advanced in justifying the elimination of these Mexican American studies courses and program. And so I will share with you a clip of what students heard and watched throughout my interview with you all here today.
I do want to say that it is my belief that the most fundamental of American values is that we are individuals and not exemplars of whatever ethnic group we were born into, and that we are entitled to be treated as individuals, that what's important about someone is what he knows, what he can do, what his character is, his appreciation of beauty or hers, and not what ethnic group he or she was born into. And that historically the function of the public schools has been to take students of different backgrounds and teach them to treat everybody as individuals and not on the basis of their narrow ethnic group that they came from. And that this program has been doing the opposite, which I think is very dysfunctional. It's doing exactly the opposite of what American public schools ought to do. I've given you.
And now, for the purpose of today's presentation, I will not be doing an analysis or sharing an analysis of some of the language and what Tom Horn, superintendent of the time, shared. I do want to highlight students' reflections and interrogations of what they heard and observed. And before I delve into that, so students were able to watch clips of this, and I paused every 30 seconds and raised the following question: what are thoughts, reactions, or feelings that come up for you based on what we just saw?
I do want to say that.
So based on this particular approach, the following findings emerged. Part of what when given a space to reflect and think about the policies that are shaping their learning experiences on the ground and schooling environments, students demonstrated that they are powerful co-conspirators in policymaking process, given their ability to deconstruct systems of oppression and their freedom dreams that they offer us. And here I really draw on the work of Bettina Love, who talks about how serving as a co-conspirator requires understanding where we stand in relation to systems of privilege and oppression, and unlearning the habits and practices that protect those systems. And so the importance of really having students work alongside educators and policymakers. And I will continue to share with you, go into detail of that in the next few slides. So in this, the first theme that emerged as part of the ways in which they are powerful co-conspirators is their ability to deconstruct systems of oppression. So students, when interrogating and unpacking the anti-mass legislative process, engaged in profound and complex analysis of the anti-mass legislative process. I highlight here the excerpt from Elena Garcia's, which is a pseudonym interview, who identified as a Latina first-generation student. And as she said, he's using these emotions to instill these systems of oppression. Like this itself is what we're learning how to deconstruct. And this bill is they don't see that they're an example of what we're learning. They really are the systems of oppression that they don't want to see us succeed, or they're not helping students succeed. It's ethos, pathos, logos. So what I want to highlight here is first what Elena and her peers continuously mentioned to or defined as an act of oppression, or what they meant by oppression. So she and her peers talked about how these courses had been integral for their academic improvement. So how their grades had drastically improved after taking these courses, but beyond that, the ways in which these courses empower them and allow them to develop a sense of self-love for themselves and for other communities and other racial groups. And given that they were seeing how despite these differences and these improved outcomes, and legislators and policymakers continued desire to eliminate these courses despite how these were positively transforming students' experiences, they saw this as an act of oppression that policymakers and educational leaders were engaging in, and that it went beyond a single action by one particular individual or those beliefs of one individual, but rather the ways in which it was systemized into part of a system of oppression. And I also want to bring our attention to the ways in which she powerfully and strategically draws on the academic knowledge that she's cultivating and generating within her courses, alongside her particular background and lived experiences, to evaluate and unpack some of the language that Tom Horn used as really utilizing emotions, or what she refers to as the tools of argumentation, ethos, pathos, and logos, to garner support in the elimination of a program that was increasing equity and supporting students of color. And based on what Elena shared, Mira and Garcia talked to us about the importance of and how particularly youth of color are strongly positioned for disrupting dominant ideas and exposing bedrock inequities, given that their lived experiences do not comport to the American dream and narratives. Now, as part of the second theme that emerged from this work was really that beyond providing a deconstruction of systems of oppression, students were able to offer and offered visions and dreams of how we can, as a society, move towards an anti-racist future. And so I want to highlight the excerpt of Liliana Figueroa, who identified as a Latina first-generation student, where she commented, And I feel like everyone should be aware of what's going on around them, because no matter what color, race, ethnic background, it doesn't matter. This society has a system, and it's, I would say, a corrupt system, but it's just mainly fixed on a racist system. You need to understand what's more privileged for you. And I just feel like having that awareness can help you not to make oppression any more worse for people. And so as Liliana's excerpt demonstrates, she possesses a level of racial consciousness and awareness in pointing to the ways we continue to be, our society continues to be structured based on a racial hierarchy, and how she expresses the importance of gaining access or having the awareness of the ways in which racism continues to play a role in our society, and that everyone should have access to that information, and that information that she particularly gained through these courses, and that this should be information that everyone should be able to access regardless of ethnic background or racial background. And she then encouraged us to also the importance of this awareness, and or how this awareness allows us to engage in self-reflection, where we can begin to detangle the privileged and marginalized oppressions that we possess, and particularly this self-awareness and self-reflection, how that can help us as individuals also combat the ways in which we perpetuate and extend harm for others, and the responsibility that we hold individually to also challenge these structures of oppression. And this particular theme, Liliana speaks to what Bettina Love refers to as these freedom dreams. So dreams that are grounded in a critique of injustice. And the second example that I want to highlight with you all today is the one from Lalo Ocampo, who identified as a Latino first generation student. And he shared the following, and it kind of opened up my viewpoint to other cultures and my own culture that I like never got to learn about, like everybody. And I feel just like anybody, you want Eurocentric people, African-American, raza, or anything to learn about any other culture, because it like makes them more inclusive when they understand other people's viewpoints. So here, Halalo Ocampo talks about how being able to learn about others' cultures is something that he wasn't able to experience or access in other spaces or in other courses, his mainstream courses, and that this is critical, this type of learning experience is critical, not just for communities of color, but of all individuals, in order to be able to have greater understanding and in order to move towards strengthening solidarity across racial lines. And also reflects the notion that Bettina Love was referring to, how these dreams are not whimsical, unattainable daydreams, but are rather critical and imaginative dreams of collective resistance. And so with highlighting these main findings of this work, I offer the following implications. So this is ongoing and developing work, considering the lack of frames and models of how to incorporate youth in more conventional research approaches that try to expand our understanding of educational policies, and the importance of continuing to refine a youth-centered critical race policy analysis and framework for those really interested in centering the voices and contributions and perspectives of those who are living the effects of the policies on ground and firsthand. And as I shared with you, the examples of today demonstrate just a glimpse into the missed opportunities that are occurring when we exclude and marginalize students from policymaking processes that are affecting their everyday realities. And the importance of countering the continued positioning of students as objects of policy, and instead develop educational policy alongside with students. And how we must continue to honor the brilliance, the resilience, and the potential of youth of color, and how they are indispensable in constructing our anti-racist future, and the possibilities that may be endless, that we can continue to explore if they're able to be part of the process of shaping these policies. And with that, I want to leave you all with a question by Quijada, Cercerel, Cahill, and Bradley that allows us to continue to think about these possibilities. So what would policy look like if young people were at the table, participating in decisions that impact their lives as active, contributing members of society? And with that, I conclude my presentation, and I thank you all for joining me today and look forward to engaging you all in a conversation about this work.
Thank you, Ambar. Thank you so much for making that presentation for us and for highlighting the voices of youth that you work closely with. I'd like to now open up conversation, and if anyone has a question, please unmute or simply raise your hand and ask your question. Go ahead, Natalia.
Thank you, Amber, for such a wonderful work. And as Danny said, for really elevating, valuing, and bringing the voice of the youth. I'm wondering if in part of your work, you have asked the youth how they want to participate in the policy and how they want to participate in that policy making. Yeah, I just wanted to ask that. But again, thank you for doing this wonderful work and for sharing it with us.
Thank you for your question, Natalia. I appreciate it. And that's a great question. I actually did not have an opportunity to directly ask students how they would like to incorporate this question, but they did share some comments that helps me kind of understand a little bit about this area, where they talked about the importance how they, not only they should be incorporating these spaces, but also their families, their communities should have some type of representation in the lawmaking in these processes. And I think for them, it was even just shocking to participate in these ways, to kind of expand the ways in which, like, hey, they can say and have a say in these, and like reflect and share their thoughts and perspectives on the policymaking process. But I'm really interested in continuing to explore and possibly add that as part of my future work, and really asking them firsthand of how they would like to participate. I also see alignment with this work with a lot of the PAR work that's being done with youth. And I also want to acknowledge PAR within my work, that I would love to continue to explore the connections between more directly having students drive a lot of this work, like having them raise the questions, having them drive the particular focus. I think it's something that could lend itself to it in the future. But I appreciate that question.
Amber, this is great. Thank you so much for presenting. I am curious if you looked at age ranges and grades and how youth might influence the policymaking process. Like, what are sort of the differences across age ranges that you saw?
I did not look across grade differences. It's also something that could be incorporating for future work. Particularly, I just focused on 11th grade students. And I also had, during this time, since I conducted this virtually, had a lot of limitations that I think maybe in other times I would have been able to reach out to more students or engage more students in classrooms. I was very restricted in there. And also I felt like that also limited the ability to reach a larger student population and to engage in this study, given the context that was occurring while I participated in the study. But it'd be really interesting to explore that. I know, I think this could be something that could be implemented or carried out even from the beginning, and just hear students' capacities and potential for engaging in these analysis even at an early age, and the importance of also providing these spaces and these opportunities in their earlier learning experiences, so that they can develop what Lee and colleagues refer to as civic reasoning and discourse skills and abilities. Great to see you, Andrew.
Go ahead, Rebecca.
so interesting. Thank you so much for sharing. And I was really excited to see high schoolers using the discourse of systems of oppression. So I'm curious to know how their teacher helped them to develop that discourse. And I'm also intrigued with your ability to participate with them on Zoom. So if you could talk more about what your role in the classroom was, because it sounds like you got to know them before you interviewed them. So I was curious about that too. Thank you. This is fun to hear about.
Thank you, Rebecca. I appreciate it. So the first question was really how they learned about systems of oppression with their teacher, correct? I'll go ahead and delve into that. So systems of oppression, the particular educator that I worked with really drew on tools to be able to engage students in developing critical thinking skills, where they were able to analyze kind of like this different systems of oppression, marginalization within our society. And that meant sometimes even providing political cartoons where students during the beginning of the course had an opportunity to kind of jot a reflection. And so this was an American government class, jot a reflection of what they saw and observed within this political cartoon. And then they could also kind of connect it to their lived experiences, how this is lived by communities of color versus or across different margins, because they not only examined oppression across racial lines, but also across gender, across sexuality and citizenship status. And so in these like analysis of the cartoons, we're able to draw on those kind of different identities to provide their own thoughts or reflections on what they were seeing. And then they were even, that often led to a conversation around whether this reflected Democratic or liberal or Republican viewpoints. And this is one of the ways in which they were really engaging in kind of like drawing on their critical experiences and talking about how the phenomena that they watched through or saw through these political cartoons were connected to like the social political context that they were experiencing and living. And so that is one of the examples in which like the particular educator I worked with sought to foster this and engage students in conversations about systems of oppression, because he would connect these political cartoons to a lot of the current experiences and inequities that are present within our society. And in terms of your second question, my participation and role within the course was definitely a bit unexpected. I had originally imagined going into the space in person and being able to connect with students through multiple forms. So throughout there, I thought about being able to chat with students during their lunch or through their lunch breaks. Or breaks throughout the day, or be able to talk more directly one-on-one and build those relationships with students when they were working individual and homework assignments or your classroom tasks. But given that I was participating through Zoom, those opportunities to strengthen my relationship with youth within these classes was very limited. So I was often engaging with them as a whole class rather than individually and as a class. I was engaging them as a whole class. I would sometimes, the educator I was working with would give me some time to share my own perspective or to be able to think, share some of the information that I've gained through my doctoral journey related to the topic that we were talking about. So those usually the ways in which I participated. I also was very mindful that this particular educator was already living or navigating a space where he was very restricted. The course had gone from 90 minutes to 60 minutes during the pandemic. And so there wasn't a lot of time. So I tried to not take up too much space so that he could also offer students the curriculum that they were supposed to be mastering. And then at other times, my participation looked like sometimes leading restorative justice circles, considering the kind of global pandemic that we were grappling and how many students were affected by this reality. And so, but I appreciate it, your question, and great question, Rebecca.
Any other question for Ambar? Lynn, thank you.
Thank you, Ambar, for this talk. It's always a pleasure to hear you present. My question is more related to, well, kind of just what you spoke about with Zoom, but if you were to go back again, now that you're submitted your PhD and you were to launch into a postdoc or assistant professorship, and kind of what would be your next steps in the field? Like, where would you go in terms of your classroom analysis, and what do you think you still feel you want to have answers to? So I guess this is more the kind of next steps. Where is this taking you empirically? What would you like to look for in the classroom, assuming you could get out of Zoom and and get into the classroom again?
Great question. So I'm thinking about my larger next steps. I want to continue to kind of refine a lot of the ways in which I engage youth. So I thought I tried different things and ways to make it more interactive. I think that's one of the things that I'm really interested about, making sure that they have an opportunity or a space to really connect. That's something that is meaningful for them and in ways that are also interactive. And so I want to continue to see if video clips is the best way to incorporating them in the process. And that's one of the things that I would want to see, and maybe see if there's ways of incorporating that more in classroom activities in my participation, if I were to be able to carry out this work in person. But I think that's particularly pertaining to this particular study. I want to continue and also ask students kind of their thoughts or perspectives related to policies that are, instead of restricting their access to ethnic studies, are expanding their access to ethnic studies. So want to see their thoughts or gather their perspectives there, and think about the ways in which I could engage them there, and possibly explore more merging of maybe what it would mean if students were driving this work and leading these questions that I'm raising. So that's what I see as my next steps.
I want to follow up on Lynn's question, Amber, and is to think about how do we create a curriculum, or how do you create a curriculum where or a program to really facilitate, promote this kind of leadership or participation in policy making by youth and their families. And I know at least in the youth that you talked to and interviewed, they all identified as Latinx, biracial, and thinking about what would be the pedagogy in the classroom or the curriculum that could facilitate the critical thinking or participation of these youth in the development of, like, now ethnic studies, we're fighting for ethnic studies in schools, or right, I don't know, but we need more allies, like from white students and their parents. So how could teachers have those tools to have allies in white students and their parents? Like, what are the tools that they might need for that? And I don't know, thinking about that as well. Yeah, I guess I know it's a huge thing, but thinking about what could be the skills or training or things that would be needed so that there are alliances that understand that this is for all of them, that there's shared interest in this. And thank you again.
Yes, so that's something I've been thinking a lot about in my work, particularly like how wonderful would it be for this to be like an activity that students are engaging in within their classroom themselves, where they are able to see a policy that not too long ago passed or that they're experiencing firsthand, and having a classroom workshop or activity or discussion around their thoughts or reflections, having an opportunity to engage this work. And I think like particularly the students who chose to interview with me identified as Latina and Latinx, but how these courses and these kind of curriculum and students themselves talked about the importance of everyone really gaining these tools, these particular understandings, and the importance of also everyone being engaging in this work, self-reflection and work in order to be able to advocate for other communities of color. And so I think it'd be wonderful, and Carol Lee and colleagues have really talked about this as civic reasoning and discourse, and what are kind of the skills and dispositions that youth must be developing to kind of participate in these conversations and contribute, and that there are these behaviors and attitudes that they must master to be able to enter these conversations. And I think it's the importance of continuing to developing those on hand. And I think this is an example of, I think that students do possess a lot of these skills and dispositions. I think it's giving them the space and the opportunity to really demonstrate these, to make the connections. So here they were able to bring in their lived experiences, their background, to analyze a particular legislation or policy that they were living. And so I think that's a very valuable space, and just to continue to opening these spaces, not just for marginalized individuals, but for all individuals, to really being able to develop these skills and the positions and these awareness, so that they don't, so that we can, as a collective, really work towards disrupting these racist policymaking processes.
Natalia, go ahead.
First, thank you so much, Amber, for sharing a wonderful talk. I'm following up a little bit on Natalia's question. One is, I was curious about the overall composition of the class that you were interacting with, and this because the sample of students that you ended up with was mostly marginalized students for the interviews, whether this was a self-selection process or whether others, how diverse was the original class? And then in the context, I'm also curious whether you spoke with the teacher that you collaborated about how she may have managed if there was resistance from white or majority students. Thank you.
Yes, so the particular class, or the larger class that I went into, kind of reflected the larger school demographics I demonstrated through my classroom 9, where it was still predominantly Latinx students, but the second groups were white students, and then also comprised of Asian American and African American youth. But nonetheless, Latinx students continue to be the majority within the class that I examined. And in terms of the self-selection process, I also think it's because I was very limited. I was hoping to receive a larger population sample, but I mean, students were really being affected by the pandemic, and the teacher himself was also struggling with having participation. Like, there was a low assignment rate turn in, and so he was constantly talking about concerns about students' level of engagement throughout this virtual transition. And so I think that also spoke to kind of like the self-selection process, that it was really only those students who kind of more identified themselves with me, or who were able to connect with me throughout the course, that volunteered to participate in this course, in the study. And I also wanted to make sure that it was voluntary to participate in the study. I wanted students to have the opportunity, considering that they were already balancing so much. And in terms of, can you remind me of the second part of your question? Was it
how did the instructor, or the experiences of the instructor in working with students that were not within the marginalized populations in teaching the course, to make them allies and if there was resistance or not.
So I didn't, throughout my classroom observations, there wasn't largely any resistance to this curriculum. Actually, one of the students that has, I highlight in other parts of my work, Lena Garcia, who identified as white and Latina, talked about how critical these courses were even for her, because even though she has pretty light skin and often passes more as, or refers to herself as white passing, rather than really Latina, talked about how these courses have helped her so much in understanding herself, even that connection to her marginalized identity, and the importance of being able to understand her other peers who may be experiencing oppression that she didn't have to go through, given her privileged identity, so of a light skin, of more of her connection to a white racial background. And so really seeing this as a positive impact, even on students who may see themselves in privileged identities, and rather than resistance, really welcomed being able to access this information and this understanding, and saw that as well as integral for their development of their own identity, because they also needed to understand others in order to understand themselves. And so I thought, so it was really interesting. And then another part of that, for other work, I will be delving into students' larger surveys responses and highlighting some of it there, where there was a little bit more of more diversity in terms of their racial background.
Go ahead, Yamina.
Okay. Thank you so much for your presentation. I found it very interesting so far. And you're kind of talking about this already, but I am wondering, with regards to your own positionality, I know you mentioned in the beginning specifically family, language, and cultural assets. I'm wondering how how you potentially brought those into these conversations, or if you felt like they were maybe relevant to building these relationships where these students felt comfortable enough to talk with you about these topics.
Love that question. Yes, I thought that was so important for my work. And one of the things that I most enjoyed in engaging students was drawing on those roots, those raíces. And I did this in multiple ways, but the one I will highlight here. So throughout the classroom activities and even throughout the interview process, I was asking students to share portions of them and to participate in my study. And I also wanted to offer what I was asking of them. So I was often trying to share parts of me. And one of the examples I really enjoyed was sharing one of the cards that my mom, dad, and my brother wrote to me, kind of really as the affirming words they shared when I was going through a period where I thought about dropping out of my doctoral program, and how like their affirming and encouraging words really served as a strength during that very difficult period. And so that I thought it was beautiful to be able to be transparent and share a little bit more about how my family has been indispensable throughout this process, really rooting me on, and how they have been part of my educational journey and supporting me. And then in opening that up space, I also gave students an opportunity to share any kind of like symbol or item that they wanted to share that kind of represented who they are, anything that they wanted to share with me or with the class. And so it was beautiful to hear students talk about their abuelita or about little totems that talked about their experiences navigating transnational worlds or boundaries. And so that's one of the ways in which I incorporated it through my classroom observations and in my one-on-one interviews, where I had more of a chance to engage students in more expansive ways.
Ambar, thank you so much for your work. Thank you all for being here, for the questions. I'm super excited about this work, not just because I'm Amber's co-chair for her dissertation, and I see McCall, her other committee member here. I'm just really inspired by this work, and we didn't even talk about critical discourse analysis, but it's just an amazing dissertation, and I can't wait for work this research to be out and in the hands of many other people. I want to just echo Rebecca's comment, is that hoping you can talk to other researchers at AERA, since they'll be presenting this there, who can, you can think with and learn from it, and to put this in the hands of folks, especially youth in Florida and other states who are facing some restrictive policies as well. So thank you again, Ambar. Thank you all. Join us next, we have a break next week because of AERA, but we'll be back the week after with guest scholars from the University of, I messed up on the calendar. University of, I'm not even gonna say it, but I'm not gonna say the university because I'm gonna get it wrong, but they are guests from South Africa. I'm guest to Dean Lauren Lindstrom, and they'll be joining us in the brown bag setting in 2 weeks. So y'all have a great week, and if you're going to AERA, have safe travels.